walk through. Oh, are you going to record it, Larry?
I just noticed it wasn't, so I hit the button.
Okay, thank you. I
Sure.
was just going to start, but that's perfect.
Oh, sorry.
No, that's fine. Yeah, so and Larry has also agreed to send the slide deck. So don't worry about taking notes unless it's not on the slides and you hear something. Also, please feel free to put any questions in the chat or you can raise your hand and we can come to your questions. I don't know what you're comfortable with, Larry. You want to
Oh,
just
yeah. Yeah,
choose at
we
the end
can get
or
questions. One thing though, Cindy, if you don't mind moderating, because I have my settings set so that the slide presentation is running full screen on my machine,
yeah.
and I won't be able to see people's chat in real time.
Okay.
So
Yeah.
if you notice, questions coming in or chat, feel free to interrupt me or, and I have at the end of the presentation, we have, time for Q&A and it's a lot of information to go through though. And if it's new to
Yeah.
people, might be some questions and I'm happy to stop wherever and answer them.
Okay. Sounds good. I'll let you know if something pops up.
Great.
All right. So without further ado, I will let Larry take it over. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Cindy. Thanks, everybody who's joining this morning. It's a pleasure to meet all of you and to be available to, provide some information. You've probably, if you're doing any work in the government space and especially in the DoD sector, you've probably already heard of CMMC. It's a buzzword and it's very timely. But we're going to help fill in the blanks for you today, and hopefully this will provide some valuable information. If you already are working on this, it should still be relevant, I think, to clarify some things. And let's go ahead and get started. So I'm going to go through these slides and hopefully everybody is seeing the screen okay. Um, our agenda today, I'll give a little bit of background on eResilience and who we are and why we're qualified to provide this information. We'll talk about some of the overall cybersecurity requirements that are part of DoD contracts. We'll look at the basics of CMMC, can dive deeper as needed for anyone who's interested. We'll talk about self-assessment, and there's a lot of confusion sometimes around that specific term, and we'll kind of clarify a little bit of that. Look at the 32 CFR and 48 CFR gotchas, we might call it, things that aren't necessarily always obvious, but could be important things to consider and could be challenging, and do a quick recap and have time for Q&A. Let me see here. There, the slides advancing. So quick background on eResilience. We're a division of Referentia Systems. That's a locally founded, locally headquartered company, although most of our customers and staff are on the mainland. But we do a lot of work in Hawaii as well. We've been more than 20 years focused on DoD information assurance and cyber technology and solutions. We're a national security agency, NSA trusted integrator, one of a small number of those nationwide. We have a large number of staffs with credentials that are heavy cybersecurity expertise. And we do specialize in NIST and CMMC and DFARS cybersecurity. As far as our credentials within specifically the CMMC world, we are what is called a C3PAO. That stands for CMMC Third Party Assessment Organization. We are the first and only authorized C3PAO in Hawaii and the Asia Pacific region. We're also an RPO, which stands for Registered Practitioner Organization, approved training provider, and we have a multitude of instructors and CCAs, which are CMMC certified assessors, RPAs, Registered Practitioner Advanced, and multiple CMMC professionals. So it's a very specialized area of cybersecurity that's really focused on meeting contractual requirements and safeguarding requirements necessary for certain types of government and DoD information. We are a division of Referentia Systems, which means that we have a lot of CSF and RMF experts on staff, which are government cybersecurity standards. The former CIO of INDOPACOM is on our staff, and we do a lot of assessments every year. Our thought leadership in this space extends past the islands. We are nationally recognized speakers and subject matter experts. We've done dozens of webinars, reached over 10,000 defense contractors. The National Contract Management Agency, or excuse me, Association, NCMA, National Contract Management Association, has annual events. We are regular speakers at those events, and we write articles about this topic for their magazine, Contract Management Magazine. In fact, we've got a new article coming out in next month's Contract Management Magazine for NCMA, and it's going to talk a lot about the challenge that prime contractors have wrestling with subcontractor cyber compliance, which is a very real issue. Many of you on this call may be subcontractors to a larger prime, and those primes may be asking you for verification that you're meeting these requirements, and hopefully this session will help you better understand and prepare for that. We've also been selected by the state of Hawaii to lead a program called CMMC Hawaii, which is going to offer some education and assistance to companies that need help, specifically getting to that first level of compliance with CMMC. There's a multi-level program. We'll go over that in a few moments, but let me know if you're interested in more information about that. Here's a list of acronyms. I know when we get into DoD and government speak, it's always very acronym rich. There's lots and lots of terms, terminology, acronyms that you probably are familiar with if you're working in this space. If you're not working in this space, I'm not going to go through every single one of these, but as Cindy mentioned, I will make the slides available to anybody who wants them. The ones that are highlighted there at the top, 32 CFR and 48 CFR final rules, those are very important to have access to, is, you know, to really see what the language is of what the government is asking you to do. The FAR CUI draft rule is something that is in the 32 and 48 CFR rules are currently final rules. The FAR CUI rule is still in draft form and undergoing final rulemaking as we speak. FAR CUI draft rule applies a similar requirement for handling controlled unclassified information to non-DoD projects. So this will be for other federal contracts, DOE, DOT, et cetera. But that FAR CUI draft rule is also very important. And then you've got the standard fare, the FAR, the DFARs, the DIBCAC, CUI, FCI. These are all important things to make sure you have in your tool belt. If you do want to go into detail on any specific item, term, et cetera, please make sure to, you know, stop me and ask, and we'll take care of it. So we're going to start with an overview of what the DoD requires in terms of cybersecurity. These are the main pillars of what you're going to need to understand and comply with. These are the FAR, which is the Federal Acquisition Regulation. FAR 52-204-21 is a basic safeguarding of covered contractor information systems clause. It's in every single federal contract, including DoD and all other agencies. So everybody doing government work for the federal government in any capacity is supposed to comply with that minimum basic safeguarding for federal contract information. We'll talk in greater detail about that in a moment. DFARS is the Defense Federal Acquisition Regulation Supplement, and that is the clauses that are part of all DoD contracts. And the underpinning original clause that's been the subject of compliance efforts for many years is DFARS 252.204-7012. DFARS 7012, as we call it, is safeguarding for covered defense information, which is essentially CUI, or controlled unclassified information, and it talks about cyber incident reporting requirements. DFARS 7012 requires companies that handle sensitive but unclassified information to implement NIST SP 800-171 for protecting that controlled unclassified information. And there are some instances where NIST 800-172 may be engaged, although those are very rare. And that's a set of enhanced requirements that are also centered on protecting CUI. DFARS 7019 and 20 are what were called interim rules that came out while the DoD was wrestling to get the CMMC program into federal law. And the 70, 19, and 20 provide an interim level of, I guess, accountability for contractors, requiring that they file basic assessment reports according to a DoD assessment methodology, and that they submit those reports to the Supplier Performance Risk System, or SPRS. 70, 19, and 20 require that those assessments be completed in alignment with NIST SP 800-171A, which is the assessment guide. So implementing NIST 800-171 for information security involves 110 cybersecurity requirements, while the assessment guide breaks those down into assessment objectives, and there's a total of 320 of those. So, when you think about what level of effort is needed to become cyber secure and compliant for DoD projects, think that number 320 should stand out as something to remember. That's the number of individual assessment objectives that must be met and validated by an assessor in order to achieve a certified level of compliance. The DIBCAC is the Defense Industrial Base Cybersecurity Assessment Center, or DIBCAC. They developed the scoring formula, and they also conduct assessments. And those 70, 19, and 20 clauses provide notification to contractors that they could be selected at random for a DIBCAC assessment. So it's putting people on notice that they need to get everything ready and be ready for assessment. Then we talk about Cybersecurity Maturity Model Certification, which is now codified into law in DFARS 252, 204, 7021, and 7025. And that is the CMMC clause. So that has recently become effective, and that increases the scrutiny on compliance with NIST 800-171, introducing mandatory third-party assessments for contractors that are handling controlled unclassified information. There are 3 levels of compliance certification or compliance levels, and senior company officials now have to sign affirmations of their compliance rather than simply attesting to compliance by the merit of signing a contract. There's a specific attestation of compliance that will be necessary. So these are the underpinning regulatory framework that puts these responsibilities on contractors. So let's talk about what information needs protection. None of what we're talking about here and in the CMMC world has to do at all with classified information. We're not talking about classified information. We're talking about unclassified information. And you see this chart is kind of tapered, so it starts wide and it ends narrow at the bottom. That's kind of intended to be a representation of the broad base to a more specific level of information distribution. The broadest base of information in federal contracting is FCI, Federal Contract Information. And that is basically, we'll talk about it further in just a moment, but that's basically any information at all that's not intended for public release. So the FAR 52, 204, 21, which I mentioned a moment ago, is equivalent to CMMC level 1, which we'll talk to in just a second. And that's the broadest base of types of information you might receive and handle as a federal contractor. And that's the lowest level of safeguarding requirement is at that FAR 52 and CMMC level 1. Next, you have controlled unclassified information, which is sensitive information, but not classified. And the types of protection that you need when handling CUI are what we just mentioned, the DFARS 7012, 7019, 7020, and 7021, which is the CMMC level 2 or higher. You might sometimes see the term CDI, covered defense information. Basically, all that is CUI for military or space purposes. So the DFARS 7012 clause references CDI, but that is synonymous with CUI. And the same protections of CUI are required for that. So you might hear it called DoD CUI or just referred to as CUI sometimes. But again, that requires implementation of the NIST SP 800-171 information safeguarding standards. And then at a at a narrower level, there's less of this, but it's still widely out there, is ITAR, or export controlled information. Now, many companies that handle export controlled information have not historically had to treat that as CUI, but for the purpose of DoD contracts, ITAR should almost always be treated as CUI. It will almost always be CUI. There are a few very isolated and occasional cases where material might be considered ITAR, but is not considered CUI, but that would be the overwhelming minority of situations, like in the 1% or less. And then there's the tightest restriction and the narrowest base there is the classified information. And again, none of what we're going to talk about today has anything to do with classified. If you're dealing with ITAR or export control information, and we do recommend speaking legal counsel about making sure that you're addressing both the export control requirements and the CUI protection requirements. If you're dealing with classified information, that's handled entirely differently, and a different system and different rules and everything apply. So those are the information types and the types of protection that are needed. Let's talk a moment about the federal contract information. Anybody performing work on any federal contract is likely dealing with some amount of federal contract information. That is information not intended for public release, that is provided by or generated for the government under a contract to develop or deliver a product or service to the government, but not including information provided by the government to the public, such as on public websites, or simple transactional information such as necessary to process payments. So what that means is FCI is basically everything that's not supposed to be released to the public. If you get a contract to build a website that will be a public website, then that information that goes on that site is not FCI. It's considered approved for general public release. But if you have any other information, the contract itself, the email communications between you and the government customer, the reports, the schedules, anything related to your project, that's all FCI, and that all requires adherence to 52-204-21. CUI is a subset of FCI. So all CUI is FCI, but not all FCI is CUI. You can think of it as FCI is the broadest population of data, and CUI is a subset within that. So CUI is controlled unclassified information, and that means it's information that requires safeguarding or dissemination controls pursuant to applicable law, regulation, or government-wide policy. But it's not classified, but there is a control. And some of those controls could be things like a distribution statement, like distribution D for DoD and DoD contractor use only. If you're familiar with dissemination controls like sensitive but unclassified, SBU, or for official use only, FOUO, those are examples of dissemination controls, and controlled unclassified information is going to be any information that is subject to a control. So what you should know about FCI versus CUI is that FCI handling is going to be involved in basically every government contract, federal contract, and all CUI is also FCI, and ITAR is almost always CUI, which means it's subject to both the rules of NIST SP 800-171 as well as export control rules. And CUI handling is what really triggers the complicated requirements in these government contracts. If you have never handled CUI and you've never had to worry about the CUI safeguarding clauses that we just mentioned, then it might seem new to you, but you will now need to register in what's called PIEE. That's the Procurement Integrated Enterprise Environment. It's an area to register as a government contractor and assign roles and responsibilities for your staff who will be using that system to report on your cyber compliance. So even if you don't handle CUI, you will still need to register in PIEE to be able to submit a CMMC level 1 attestation. And we'll dig into that here in just a moment. But this could be something new if you haven't previously done it. And then there's purely COTS. COTS is commercial off the shelf. If you sell a widget, a product, you sell it to everybody, the general public, it's available in stores, there's a SKU number. If you have an unmodified, uncustomized, generally available product that you are also selling to the government, that's considered commercial off the shelf, those are exempt from these regulations. So sometimes there's a little confusion because sometimes companies offer a product, but the government orders a specialized version of it, or there's some custom specifications that modified that product, and then it no longer is COTS. If you look at the pyramid shape on the right, you see at the very tippy top is the very small amount of qualified, valid COTS products that are exempt from these. Then you see the next largest amount of requirement will be for the CUI handling, including ITAR. And then the largest amount of data is going to be your FCI, which is everything. It's the contracts, the reports, your emails, specifications, anything not meant for the public. So these are very important distinctions to be aware of, because your responsibility as a contractor will be based on the information that you're handling. So the responsibility to safeguard CUI or FCI goes along with the FCI or CUI. The custody of the information is what determines the responsibilities for safeguarding. If you're handling FCI and not CUI, that's one thing. If you're handling CUI, that's an entirely different thing. Hopefully that makes sense. So let's talk about the basics of CMMC. To start with, these are the CFR, Code of Federal Regulations. This is the law. This is how CMMC has now been codified into law. 32 CFR is the regulation that describes the CMMC program in great detail. It's defined there. And that became effective at the end of last year. And that helped establish the entire CMMC assessment and certification regime that is, as we speak, becoming a multi-billion-dollar industry. But defining the CMMC program is different from actually implementing the CMMC program in contracts. And in order for the government to implement CMMC, they had to have the 48 CFR ruling, which was on a separate track, because that provides the actual language for the contract clauses. 32 CFR defines what CMMC is. 48 CFR provides a vehicle for contracting officers to insert CMMC into contracts. So those are two different linchpins that both had to undergo detailed and multi-year long review and development, and ultimately final review and final approval process in order for the CMMC program to officially launch and start appearing in contracts. And that has now happened as of last month. 48 CFR final rule became effective on November 10th. And after November 10th, we have begun seeing CMMC contracts start to appear in new DoD solicitations and contracts. So that will continue to trickle out into more and more contracts as time goes on. We'll talk about their timeline in just a moment. But these two documents form the basics for the CMMC program. And if you have time and you have interest, I highly recommend reviewing these. So let's talk about the CMMC program. And this is how the framework looks. This is what is defined by that 32 CFR, is this multi-level certification and assessment and attesting framework. At the bottom, level 1, the most basic, is CMMC level 1. There are 15 security requirements associated with compliance, which are aligned with what's in FAR 52, 204, 21 already. So in theory, any government contractor who's experienced and understands the contracts that they're signing should already be aware of these requirements and have them already, executed. Not everybody always does. There's no real enforcement regime involved in this. It's simply by signing a federal contract that includes that clause, you would be attesting to your compliance. The same way you're attesting that you're meeting the Buy American Act, or that you don't have human trafficking, or any of these other clauses incorporated by reference often. CMMC takes level 1 to be that basic level of compliance with protecting federal contract information. That what's different about CMMC compared to FAR 52 20421 is that you do have to do the exact same things in terms of the security controls, but with CMMC, you're going to have to annually reassess and reaffirm compliance every year. Whereas with FAR 52, once you've signed your contract, if it's a multi-year contract, you're good to go for those years. CMMC will be an annual reassessment. Level 2, if you're handling CUI, CMMC level 2 will involve 110 security requirements. The 15 requirements of level 1 are a subset of those 110. So if you've done level 1, you've done, just over 15% of level 2. But those requirements for level 2 are going to need to be assessed by a third party in most cases. And that's what a C3PAO does. And that's what I mentioned, this entire industry being stood up around this. So the level 2 requirements are going to be every 3 years. They have to be reassessed. And there will also be an annual affirmation that the compliance remains continuous during the intervening years. Level 3 of CMMC adds another 24 requirements on top of this from the NIST 800-172. And level 3 is only going to be for very, very few, probably less than 1% of contracts. And that will be for highly sensitive contracts that are still unclassified but sensitive. And level 3 will require everything that's in level 2, plus these additional requirements, which will be validated by the DIBCAC after a C3PAO has validated level 2. So those are the 3 levels of CMMC that you're hearing about. Level 1, very basic, but still is a little bit more detailed than many companies realize. Level 2 is very complicated. Level 3 is much more beyond that. This is the timeline for the CMMC rollout. Phase 1, the initial implementation of CMMC, began last month on November 10th. It will run for 12 months, and during that 12 months, new solicitations that are being issued by DoD will be selectively added for CMMC. So not every new solicitation or contract that comes out will include CMMC during phase 1, but selected contracts will include it. Right now, last time I checked on the sam.gov, there's a handful. I think there's maybe somewhere between 5 and 10 contracts that have already been released, or solicitations that have already been released that include CMMC requirements in those first few weeks. But we are going to see a steady increase over the next year as phase 1 of initial implementation is rolled out. And during that year, the expectation for CMMC level 2 will almost always be a self-assessment rather than a third-party assessment. Level 1 of CMMC, I think I may have failed to mention in the past slide, level 1 is always self-assessment. There is not a third-party certification requirement for level 1. On level 2, the contracting officer will have the opportunity and let's see here, I think someone's joining. For level 2, the DoD contracting officer will be able to determine if it should be a self-assessment or a third-party assessment. In phase 2 of CMMC implementation, which begins November 10th, 2026, from that point forward, most DoD solicitations and contracts that involve handling CUI will require a third-party certification rather than a self-assessment. The reason for this phased rollout of third-party certification is there's a bottleneck of qualified and approved assessors and authorized organizations to conduct these assessments. Right now, there's just under 100 nationwide organizations that are authorized as C3PAOs. They're working to, exponentially grow that over the next year plus. But there are opportunities to get assessed for companies that are ready for it. And during phase 2, that 12 months will be primarily third-party assessment. Phase 3 will almost always be third-party assessment, and we'll start to introduce the CMMC level 3 requirements. And phase 4, which begins 36 months after the phase 1 start, by that point, every single DoD contract will always have CMMC requirements. So this self-assessment, a lot of companies are thinking that self-assessment might give them some wiggle room where, hey, it's not quite as high of a standard as third-party assessment. That would be what we consider kind of a myth, that self-assessment is a lesser standard. The reality is that you still have to meet all the same objectives. You have to have evidence prepared for all of the objectives in order to self-assess. So what that means is it's basically the same heavy lift, just without the third-party eyeballs on it. And that evidence of your compliance must be stored for a minimum of 6 years. When it comes to CMMC level 1, there's also some misconception that level 1 is exactly the same as FAR 52. In reality, as I mentioned a moment ago, FAR 52, 20421 is bundled into every federal contract, but when you sign that contract, you're basically attesting to your compliance. Whereas with CMMC level 1, there's going to be an annual reaffirmation necessary. And the other really big difference between what's in CMMC level 1 and what's in FAR 52 is that CMMC level 1 does require evidence retention. Even though it's a self-assessment, you still have to gather and maintain and retain evidence for each of 59 individual assessment objectives and keep that evidence on file for 6 years in case it's ever needed. That was not required by FAR 52. So another myth about self-assessment is that the self-assessment is kind of the same as the basic assessment that is required under DFARS 7020. And the basic assessment is not at all the same as a self-assessment. It is a self-assessment of sorts, but the DFARS 7020 basic assessment requirement really asks a contractor to go through and determine which of the 110 requirements they meet and compile a score based on that and submit that score to the government through the SPIRS system. And the score could be anything. There's no minimum requirement. You could have a negative score. As long as you've reported accurately, then your DFARS 7020 basic assessment is valid and gets you compliant with the existing requirements until CMMC comes along. And under CMMC, you will then have to self-assess. And the self-assessment for CMMC level 2 does, in fact, require a minimum score of 88, which represents 80% of the 110 compliance requirements being completed. And the remaining that are not completed have to only be those that are part of a list of allowable POAM, we call it, plan of action and milestones items. When you have completed some but not all of the requirements, then whatever is not completed goes into a POAM. It's things that you plan to complete, and you have a plan of action to get done, and you have milestones to keep you on track. But there's only certain types of requirements that are allowable to be incomplete and still have a passing score on a self-assessment. So a conditional assessment is when you've got 80% of the items done and none of the remaining ones are other than what's on that list of allowable POAM items. Only allowable items remaining. And then those items have to be completed within 180 days. So a self-assessment for CMMC is a highly detailed exercise that has a high level of requirement, whereas a self-assessment under DFARS 7020 is simply an assertion that, hey, we've got this much of it done, our score is minus 25 or our score is 62 or whatever it is, and there's no requirement for any minimum. That's the big difference between those two. let's talk about some of the gotchas. I was mentioning that we want to cover that, and I'm mindful of everyone's time. I want to try and go quick here so we can get to questions. You want to be careful about some of these things that are buried in those regulations. Evidence retention for 6 years is one of them, and that's required even for level 1. So if there's 59 assessment objectives in level 1 that are associated with the 15 requirements, you need to gather evidence for each of those 59 and have them stored and available if there was ever some kind of issue that required someone to audit this. For level 2, there's 320 assessment objectives. Again, that evidence you have to have evidence for every one of them, and that evidence has to be stored for 6 years. And the reason it's being stored for 6 years is at the request of the Department of Justice, which a couple of years ago established what they call the Civil Cyber Fraud Initiative, which is specifically a branch of the DOJ that's going after cybersecurity misrepresentations on the part of contractors. So there have been multiple prosecutions in this space using the False Claims Act, and multiple multi-million-dollar settlements have already been closed around companies that misrepresented. So the reason they want you to hold on to that evidence is if there ever is an issue and there's an investigation, you're going to be, covering yourself by having that evidence. So this, for companies that already are aware of the CUI and already working on CMMC, none of this might really sound like surprising news. But companies that have never handled CUI and don't intend to handle CUI might find that this evidence gathering is a lot more than what they realized about how to just be compliant with level 1. So if you've never had to have a system security plan or had to file a report in SPIRS, that's all going to be new to you if you're level 1. Some other gotchas are the complicated web of expiration dates that will be established. So every assessment has an expiration date. Level 1 assessments expire after 1 year. Level 2 assessments expire after 3 years, but require annual reaffirmations. And so basically, when you conduct an assessment and submit an affirmation, those are, unless they're done on the same date, then there's 2 different dates. There's an assessment date and an affirmation date, and there's going to be an expiration date. And companies are going to have to keep track of when these assessments that have been filed expire and make sure to renew them annually or risk falling out of compliance. So that's a challenge enough just for the companies themselves that are doing this, but imagine what it's like for the prime contractor who might have a large number of subs that they also have to keep track of and make sure that those subs are all compliant. There will be a big web of multiple expiration dates that have to be monitored. So to ensure a fully compliant bidding team, that continuous compliance is now going to become something that just has to constantly be reported on. Here's another, maybe the biggest surprise hidden in these rules is some of the cost estimate assumptions that the government is putting on this. Now, for CMMC level 1, that's not covered here. This is talking about CMMC level 2. Basically, they're estimating a fairly high amount, and the reason, even though government estimates aren't necessarily accurate, and it could be wildly different from this, I think the important thing here is this reveals the level of effort that the government believes is necessary in order to adequately address these requirements. So when you look at the costs, it's starting with the cost of implementing NIST 800-171, and that includes labor, hardware, and annual, upkeep. For a small business, they're thinking it's going to cost about $175K to get that done initially, and then another $100K plus every year to keep it up. And so you've got a fairly large amount over 3 years of the cost for developing and maintaining compliance with CMMC level 2. If it's a bigger business, other than small, then it's quite a bit more. The cost of preparing for the assessment and obtaining the assessment is different, and it's estimated in a different place. And they estimate the cost of assessment at around 100K plus for both small and large entities. And so that means that the total cost, including a third-party assessment over 3 years, this is, again, it's just an estimate, and there will likely be ways to identify, ways that are less expensive or could be more expensive than this. But the total 3-year cost, including labor, hardware, prep, and assessment, is close to $500,000 for 3 years for a small business, and close to $2 million for a large business. And the majority of that is repeating every 3 years. Now, the source of this information is straight out of the government published documents. In the case of the cost estimate for implementing NIST 800-171, that's published in the FAR CUI draft rule that I mentioned earlier. And the cost of obtaining third-party assessment is published in the 32 CFR final rule, which is the CMMC program definition. So interestingly, the DoD was able for many years to avoid estimating the cost of NIST SP 800-171 implementation because it was already required for DoD contractors handling CUI. So every time we held a webinar featuring someone like John Ellis, the co-founder of the DIBCAC, he'd come on our events and say, oh yeah, well, we don't estimate the cost for the 171 because you're already supposed to be doing that. Government's assumption is every DoD contractor already has that done. So the 32 CFR only estimated the incremental cost of adding the assessment regime. So what should it cost you to prepare for and obtain a third-party assessment? That's how much they put into 32 CFR. But the FAR CUI rule adds the requirement to implement NIST 800-171 to all federal contractors who handle CUI, and they did not previously have to do that by previously existing clauses, as is the case with DoD. So the FAR CUI rule includes that estimate for implementation, and that's where they come up with their, $383,000 figure. Now, why is this so important? I know it might be a sticker shock, and it might seem like it's prohibitively expensive for small businesses. But if you go into those documents and you read how they arrive at those numbers, you'll see the level of effort that the government expects people to put into actually properly documenting and validating their compliance. And that's the main message here is be aware of the level of effort that the government expects is going to be put into this. Whether you find ways of doing it at a lower cost or not, you're still going to have a fairly high level of effort.
Hey, Larry.
Yes.
I had a question from,
Sure.
I think it's Andrew.
Hi.
He's asking if, can the CMMC level 2 certify audited only be done for a certain area of operation, work area, office, and specific equipment versus certifying the whole organization?
So that's a great question. And the answer is that it's either way is possible, but to segment only a certain part of the operation for the CMMC level 2 certification, level 1 is going to be everything. Level 1 is the enterprise in almost every case. Level 2 could be what's called an enclave. But for level 2 to be limited to that enclave is going to require a very, very strictly adhered to level of segregation between the enclave system and the company's corporate network. So the network connectivity is an issue, and properly establishing an enclave is difficult because it cannot touch the actual corporate network at all. So segmentation is the challenge. We can dig into more of that as needed, but it's a great question because yes, in fact, that's an absolutely valid and very effective and very useful strategy is to enclave and only have to deal with these requirements on the CUI handling portion of the network. But that means that there has to be a very strictly adhered to gap. Hopefully that makes sense. We're talking about timeframes, and one of the gotchas that's in these clauses is that at any time, the government could, at its discretion, jump out of one of the time frames and add requirements that are from a later time frame. So if you think, well, I won't have to deal with third-party certification until at least phase 2 or phase 3, that might not always be the case, because if the government decides that they want third-party certification, even during phase 1, they have the right to do that. So that's one thing to be aware of. And that's one of the reasons why it's important to treat a self-certification, or rather self-assessment for CMMC level 2 just the same way as you would treat your preparation for a third-party certification assessment. You have to have all of the requirements completed, and you have to have all of the evidence in hand in order even to self-assess properly. So you'll be ready, I guess, is the main message. You need to be ready for that third-party requirement, even if you're in phase 1 or 2. Then they can also add other requirements. They could add CMMC to contract modifications at their discretion as well, even though it's not supposed to go into all mods until a later phase. So if you're thinking you're going to bid on especially highly sensitive DoD contracts, you should be thinking along the lines of being ready sooner than later and knowing that these requirements could pop out at any time for any of these phases. The other thing, I mentioned it a little bit earlier about the DOJ enforcement. The FCA False Claims Act cases are on the rise, and they're not limited to large institutions. We see big companies like Raytheon, getting dinged for they paid a $8.4 million settlement to resolve a False Claims Act around this. But even small companies, Morse Corp is a good example. It's a relatively recent case that settled for $4.6 million. Morse Corp's less than 200 employees, and what they did that they got in trouble for is actually, from what we have seen, very, very common throughout the defense industrial base. They misreported their score. They didn't change their reported score even after they had information that clarified that the score was incorrect. They did not have a properly formatted system security plan. And the person who blew the whistle on Morse Corp got 1/4, I think, of the settlement. I mean, the whistleblower cases and bid protests are very likely to rise as a result of this enforcement. And the cost of compliance might sound, high, but compare that with the cost of, being found liable for a violation and prosecuted for false claims. That's even worse. So we're going to start to see over the next few years, I think, a substantial increase in whistleblower and bid protest types of operations. Another kind of a gotcha. I mean, if you're planning for this, it's probably okay either way, but CMMC was supposed to be a quote unquote pre-award requirement, which means that in order to receive the contract award, you would have to have your CMMC compliance verified. But solicitations are already coming out, and in the 48 CFR, it clearly says what's going to happen is when you self-assess or a third-party assessment for CMMC, when you report that to SPIRS, you'll receive a UID, a unique identifier. And some proposals or solicitations will require that you list the UID in the proposal itself. That actually makes it kind of a pre-bid requirement more than a pre-award requirement. There was an expectation that, well, maybe, you could bid on a contract, and if awarded, there would be time to still complete the last things you had in place and get your CMMC compliance ready before actually executing that award. But as evidenced here, and what we're actually seeing in some of the released contracts that include CMMC requirements, there is a proposal requirement to submit the UID, which would mean you have to have your compliance in place before you even bid. So those are some gotchas. I know we're getting close to our end of our hour, but I want to do a recap, and I'm available to stay on a little bit extra if there's questions or you want further discussion. But what we want to do is recap now for small businesses. What are these clauses? What are your responsibilities, et cetera? So again, the Federal Acquisition Regulation, Clause 52, 204, 21 should be new to nobody who's been doing any type of federal work. This is in every federal contract already. It's federal contract information safeguarding, and there's 15 security requirements. Then that's equivalent to 17 of the 110 NIST SP 800-171 requirements. I would point out, however, that the FAR 52 requirements, even though there's not a huge technical barrier to some of those, I mean, it's basic stuff, but it's not always something that everybody's fully familiar with the fine print on. For example, every company at level 1 must be maintaining a visitor log, a site access log to your facility, including your employee access, escorting visitors, destroying federal contract information in hard copy form with a NIST approved cross-cut shredder that shreds particles down to 2/100ths of an inch. And not everyone's doing that. So make sure if you're expecting level 1 to be a breeze, that you go through and read the fine print and know exactly what you're supposed to be doing, because not everybody does. For handling CUI, it's DFARS 7012, 7019, 7020. That means you have to implement the 110 requirements of NIST 800-171, and at the minimum have a system security plan or SSP in place, and a plan of action and milestones or POAM that covers how you're going to meet any unimplemented requirements. You also have to pay attention to the cyber incident reporting clause that's in 7012, which requires you to report an incident within 72 hours of discovery, and that requires imaging of your network. And it also means that any service providers that you have, external or cloud service providers that you're handling CUI through, would also have to image their systems if there's a breach that requires an investigation. So that limits the number of qualified CSPs that you might use for some of your CUI handling work. Very important distinction you have to keep aware of. With CUI handling, you have to be registered through PIEE or with a medium assurance certificate in order to report those cyber incidents. And contractors that handle CUI have to report a basic assessment score, as I mentioned earlier, but the score can be anything as long as you've got an SSP in place. That's the only requirement that is absolutely mandatory. You could have a minus 203 as long as your SSP is there. You're still qualified to handle CUI under DFARS 70, 19, and 20. But when it comes to 7021, the Cybersecurity Maturity Model Certification or CMMC program, now it's no longer okay to just have any score. You have to have a minimum. And for the 3 levels of CMMC, level 1, all of the FAR 52 requirements, the minimum score for that is all of them, 100%. Level 2, 110 requirements, the minimum score for that is 80% or a score of 88 with only allowable POAM items remaining. And level 3, you're going to have all of those additional requirements from NIST 800-172. Contracts cannot be awarded unless the entire supply chain is compliant at the required levels. So this is going to be where you might get heat from your prime. If you're a subcontractor, you may have primes wanting you to demonstrate that you're compliant. And achieving compliance is complicated. It requires evidence gathering, and it impacts basically every DoD contractor. So again, these are the things small businesses should know. Level 1's achieved only through self-assessment. Most level 2 will ultimately require self-assessment at first for this first year, but then after that, third-party assessment. And level 3 will always be third-party with the government involved. So this is my last slide, and I just want to kind of put it in the context of you fall into one of these categories if you are a government contractor. You're either handling DoD contracts with CUI, or you're handling DoD contracts with only FCI and no CUI, or you're not doing DoD work, but you're doing other federal work with CUI, or your other federal work does not include CUI, but does have FCI. That's basically, if you're a government contractor at the federal level, you're in one of these categories. So if you're in category 1, DoD contracts with CUI, you're going to have to meet all of these requirements: DFARS 7012, 7019, 7020, 7021, and do that self-assessment first, and eventually have a C3PAO third-party assessment. And a senior company official has to be the one that reports in SPIRS and affirms these things. You should also be prepared on all of these to share your status on a confidential basis with your prime or with the government on request. If you're handling DoD contracts category 2 here without CUI, but with FCI, you're going to have to comply with FAR 52. You're going to have, on contracts that have CMMC requirements, you will have to self-assess to level 1. And again, share your status when asked. If you're not doing DoD work, but you do work for the DOT or the DOE or some other federal agency, and you have CUI, right now you're only required to still meet FAR 52, but in the future, there will be a requirement through that FAR CUI rule that's currently in final rulemaking. There will be a requirement to implement NIST 800-171. And if you're working on non-DoD federal contracts with no CUI, but with FCI, again, that existing default baseline is FAR 52. And evidence in support of CMMC level 1 and 2 will be needed for those DoD contracts. And you have to store that evidence for 6 years. So that's the recap. Hopefully this has been helpful. We can throw it open to questions and answers.
Thanks, Larry. That is intense.
And that's just the very, 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 very basic
high level.
Very basic level.
I did have a question, sorry, from Min, and then there's another question in the chat.
Sure.
What is the time frame to allocate for getting the CMMC level 2 process? And then they mentioned last time they checked, even to get an appointment was out 6 months. I don't know if there's like a backlog of companies that are trying to get through this process.
Right. You're asking about two different things. You're asking what is the time frame to implement everything needed to achieve CMMC level 2 compliance? That's one thing. How long will it take your company to actually become compliant? The other thing is how long will it take you to obtain a certification assessment through when there's a backlog of, a queue for assessments. I can tell you right now that the C3PAO third-party assessment should not be difficult to obtain because nobody's basically ready right now. There's not a huge queue. There's people who think they're ready, but they're not. There's very, very, very few companies that are ready for an assessment by a third party. So the two parts of your question, the second part, what about this backlog of 6 months to obtain an assessment? I would probably not worry so much about that because the chances are that you're not ready for that assessment. If you're really ready for that assessment, you'll be able to find one. The first part of the question is the hard part. How long will it take you to become ready for that assessment? And the estimate for a well-organized, well-equipped company with adequate resources is 12 to 18 months. It's taken many companies that we're aware of multiple years to get ready for this, and they're still not ready. Some companies have really been diligent and buckled down and got it done in that 12-month or so time frame, and that's not unreasonable to expect that. If you really have a dedicated effort, maybe it can be done in that time frame. However, any company that's wanting to plan for DoD business should already be working on this or should really jump on it with full vigor right away and expect it's going to take a while. Because if you think about it, just the assessment, just the evidence, just gathering the evidence of your implementations, let alone how long it might take you to implement everything. But once it's implemented, having it properly documented and having that documentation excerpted to present in evidentiary form as artifacts to an assessor, and there's 320 of those. So if you're in a company responsible for organizing your evidence, let's say, you're going to have to check with somebody to make sure you got the most recent copy of the training manual or the security policy and go to the file server and make sure you pulled the right one and pull out the excerpt that's relevant and save that off as a file for evidence. And, maybe you get a drink of water or go to the bathroom or take a phone call. Before you know it, you've spent an hour collecting an artifact, and you're going to need 320 of those. So you have multiple hundreds of person hours involved just in evidence gathering. Does that make sense?
Yep. Hopefully, Andrew, if you want, you can come off. You can get on speaker if you want. There's another question from Krista. How do subs provide to primes that they're in compliance? Oh, sorry. Did somebody want to speak up?
I can answer the question you just asked, and anyone else has additional questions, we'll keep going. So the question was, how can subs provide evidence to their primes that they are in compliance? And the answer to that is very, very simple. You're going to use either screenshots or a PDF that you generate from SPIRS. So depending on what type of compliance you're being asked to validate, let's say the prime contractor wants to know that you're CMMC level 1 compliant, you're going to be able, when you go into SPIRS and file your level 1 assessment and affirmation, you'll be able to generate a PDF that includes your UID for that assessment, and you'll submit that PDF to your prime. That also applies to level 2 as well. And if you have a third-party assessment of level 2, then the third party, the C3PAO, is going to provide you with a certification document, but they're also going to go into EMAS and file that finding within EMAS, but you will still, as a contractor or a subcontractor, be responsible to go into SPIRS and report that, yes, you've done a third-party assessment, and that's you'll get a UID every time. You're going to get a PDF that indicates the date of and the number of that assessment.
We also had another question. Is there a guideline set up or a suggested procedure to do this, or is that part of the SPIRS
Are you
process?
talking about a guideline for reporting or a guideline for implementing those requirements? There's a guide. The guideline for how to implement all of these requirements is published in the CMMC Level 1 and Level 2 assessment guides. Those are critical documents that everybody should have. I'll repeat it because I don't think it was in the slides. I tried to trim this down to key points, but CMMC Level 1 and Level 2 assessment guides are the underlying foundational documents that everybody should be looking at. They are based on NIST 800-171A, which is the document that provides all of the assessment objectives. And those are the guides that tell you basically, I like the CMMC Level 1 and 2 guides because they're plain language. They use a lot of examples and scenario-based examples. They make it really clear what's needed. And those are critical guides that will guide you in what's needed for your compliance. As far as what's needed for reporting your compliance in SPIRS, there's a PIEE and SPIRS both have help desks. PIEE help desk will help you get registered if you have a problem. They have great telephone support, in fact. SPIRS not as much on the phone side, but definitely on the email side. But both of them have both phone and email published listings for help. And there is the SPIRS site does have some guidance documents in terms of what you're going to need to do to establish the proper registration and the proper roles and all of that in order to actually file those reports.
Great, thank you.
You bet.
I just want to let everybody know I did drop Larry's email in the chat, so grab that if you need to, if you have any other questions that you think of later.
I can send you those documents I mentioned as well if you don't have access already, like the Level 1 and Level 2 assessment guides, 32 and 48 CFR, etc.
Yeah, so I'll send Larry, if it's okay, I'm going to send your email addresses to Larry and he can send you resources as well as this slide deck.
Sure.
Yeah.
Is this about the right level you think of information that everybody's looking for, this kind of, overview, or was there any specific areas people wanted to dive more deeply into at all?
You can either unmute or just pop it in the chat if anybody has any responses.
Okay. Anyone else?
Hey, that's great.
This has been helpful. It's nice to be able to talk to everybody, and I appreciate your time and look forward to answering questions if you've got them.
Yes, thank you so much, everybody. So you'll be getting an email from Larry, and I'm going to try and get this video up on our site just for reference. Sounds like everybody appreciated it.
Great.
And yeah, thanks so much for your time, Larry, and your expertise. That was a lot of information.
Yeah, it is. It's a lot of information, especially if you're new to this.
Yes.
But it's hard to distill it down to anything really even simpler than that because there is a lot that needs to be addressed.
Yeah, that makes sense. But it's a good start. So
excellent.
We will start from there. Thank you so much. And then hopefully we'll see everybody else next time.
Yep. Let us know if you have anything you need help with. Oh, I'm sorry. There is one thing. I wanted to mention that I think I said it earlier, but we are starting a partnership with
that's
Cyber
right.
Hawaii, to offer some help, additional education, additional resources, and additional assistance will be available for qualifying subcontractors. If you've got a prime contractor and you're actively working on a DoD project, you can ask your prime You can either forward us their information or forward them our information. If they want to participate in that program and refer you into that program, there will be a number of level 1 assistance packages that are funded by the state, by DBED, that will help local contractors address level 1 requirements. It won't make you compliant, but it'll give you like some consultation or training focused on level 1, which is a good stepping stone to prepare yourself, for what's needed for level 2. So please definitely reach out to me if you have questions about that program, and we'll see if we can help, make it available to you. And there will be some educational videos and stuff like that as well associated with it, all for free.
Oh, that's great. Hey, Larry, if you can send me a blurb about that, I want to send
Yeah.
that out in my next newsletter because that's
Okay.
awesome.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Very,
Okay,
very. All
great.
right. All
That'd
right.
be
Well,
perfect.
thanks everybody.
Thank you, everybody. Take care. Happy holidays.
Yes, you too, everyone. All right.
Okay.
Uh-huh.
Bye.